In the morning like this for a little breakfast chat about Children of Monsters, Jay Nordlinger's new book. We're very pleased to have him with us today at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. My name is John Davidson. I direct the Center for Healthcare Policy here at TPPF, and I also review books for National Review and others, and so I'm very happy to be talking about Jay's new book this morning. Jay Nordlinger is a senior editor at National Review and a book fellow of the National Review Institute. He's a music critic at the New Criterion. Since 2002, he's hosted a series of public interviews at the Salzburg Festival. He hosts the Need to Know podcast with Mona Sharon and another podcast, Q&A. In 2011, he filmed The Human Parade with Jay Nordlinger, which is a TV series bringing hour-long interviews with various personalities, and he is the author previously of Peace, They Say, which is a history of the Nobel Peace Prize. And his new book, as you all know, is Children of Monsters, which is a fascinating study of the children of dictators. So I'm going to have Jay come up and say a few words, and then we're going to sit down and have a conversation about the book, and then we're going to open it up for questions and discussions with you all. And I think afterwards there'll be a book signing out in the foyer. So with that, please help me welcome Jay Nordlinger.
Thank you, and thanks so much for coming. I love being in this place. It's a palace. It's the Taj Mahal. I'm very impressed. I was just thinking, when I was growing up, there was a big star named John Davidson of screen and stage and other things. So this is the second one. I'm glad this organization exists. Bush 41 referred to points of light. As far as I'm concerned, this is a point of light. And I lived in Austin just briefly for a month and a half in 2000 when I took a leave of absence from National Review to assist the speechwriting staff for the Bush campaign, the George W. Bush campaign here. And Austin was growing then and even more now. I'll just tell this little story that I told someone earlier. I've come from Denver, and I used a travel agent. And I said to the travel agent, "You mean you can fly directly from Denver to Austin?" He said, "Jay, where you been? You can fly from London to Austin direct." So that's pretty good. I've written a sort of an odd book and about the sons and daughters of dictators. And lots of people ask, how did this book come about? So I thought I'd answer that right off the bat. And this is how I begin my foreword. So if you read the book, you're welcome to skip those paragraphs because this is pretty much it. I was in Albania some years ago for the first time. And I like saying that because it's such a boast, to have been in Albania even once, but I have been back. And I was speaking under State Department auspices. So there's the second boast. But now I'm pretty much done. And Albania was 10 years beyond the collapse of communism. And Albania suffered one of the worst dictatorships of the whole 20th century. There was really nothing else like it on earth except the Kim Il-sung dictatorship in North Korea. And the Albanian dictator, Enver Hoxha, admired Kim quite a bit and emulated him to a degree. Albania was kind of a European North Korea. No one came into the country, no one went out. For about 40 years, Hoxha ran this state as a kind of personal dungeon. And when I was there, it occurred to me, did Hoxha have children? Because if so, how could they live? What were their lives like? Did they keep their last name? Did they have to leave the country? Could they go out? And how did people react to them? What were they like? And I thought, because I'm a magazine writer, that might make a good magazine piece, because a magazine writer is always looking for his next meal, as a colleague of mine says. So I thought the Hoxha children I could do, and he did have children, 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter was an architect who had helped design the shrine to her father. And then I thought, in the next thought, well, you could do a survey of such sons and daughters and make a book of it called Children of Monsters. And I put that idea on the back burner where most of my ideas go. And years later, I brought it out because a publisher wanted this subject. And so I wrote that book. Hoxha's in there, of course, and his family. I've written about 20 dictators and their children. That's a nice, juicy, round number, 20. And you might think I aimed for it, but I didn't. I just drew up a list of dictators I thought I should survey, and it came to 20. A couple I would have wanted to include, but they didn't have children. And I think especially of Lenin and Ho Chi Minh. And I did modern dictators, 20th century and into the 21st. Fidel Castro ruled into the 21st, and the third Kim is now on the throne in North Korea, and a second Assad in Syria. I could have gone back to antiquity. You could have done a broader study. Caligula had a child, a little girl, and she was murdered the same day as her parents in 41 AD. She was just a year and a half. And then in 16th century Russia, Ivan the Terrible actually killed his son, Ivan the Tsarevich, with his scepter, with his very scepter, in a fit of rage. He didn't really mean to. It was kind of like road rage. And he killed him with a scepter, and was immediately horrified by it. And this moment was later captured in the late 19th century by the Russian painter Repin, a gripping painting. Bokassa of Central Africa, whom I do study, did kill people with his scepter. It was really a walking stick, an ebony walking stick. He killed people with his own hands, or at least his own stick. He did not kill any of his own children, however. He did imprison a few of his children. He was a nightmare, Bokassa. Crowned himself emperor Napoleon style, and rechristened his country the Central African Empire. Very strange story. In any event, I do these 20 dictators, and the pattern is this. I start with World War II dictators, and I throw in Franco. So you have Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Tojo, Franco. And then I stay in the Far East after Tojo for Mao and Kim. And then go back to Europe for Hoxha and Ceausescu of Romania. Then the Caribbean for the Duvalier family and Castro. I do 3 Arabs, Gaddafi, Assad, and Saddam, and Khomeini in Iran, and 4 Africans, Mobutu, Bokassa, Idi Amin, and Mengistu, the so-called Stalin of Ethiopia, which is a name that he certainly earned. And then my last chapter is a little coda, a little too short to be a chapter. Pol Pot, the genocidal dictator of Cambodia, had a daughter late in his life, long after he'd fallen from power. And she got married last year in a very pretty ceremony. She is a lovely young woman, about 30, and she earned a master's degree in English literature. And this is noteworthy because her father and his gang, the Khmer Rouge, killed people who wore glasses on suspicion that they were literate, and that made them dangerous. So that's my lineup, that murderer's row, and they were all murderers. Although, I say in the dictator business, you really have to grade on a curve. A couple of the ones I have in there really don't deserve to be in a book called Children of Monsters. They were relative lambs compared to these genocidal dictators. And obviously, there are themes and patterns in my book because these men and women, the kids as I call them, have a common circumstance. They're the son or daughter of a dictator. But I don't do too much generalizing because they are individuals. They share a situation, but they cope with that situation in different ways. Some are absolute brutes like their dad, want to be just like their dad. And some are quite admirable people, and most, I would say, are in between. But they all have led fascinating lives, and from their point of view, all too fascinating. So this book brings up questions of nature-nurture, for example, loyalty. What is loyalty? How far do we go with loyalty? Parenthood, childhood, dictatorship, democracy, free will. All these questions come up. So you can look at the book and think of this book that way, or treat the book as a succession of, in some cases, sensational stories. I do a bit of both. Some readers of this book have said, including Mark Helprin, who wrote a blurb for me, said that the book made them more appreciative of democracy and the rule of law and ordered liberty. Now, I didn't aim for that effect, but it's interesting that many readers have come away with that feeling. I say many readers. I mean 4, 5. In my world, that's rather a lot, you know. I think the famous old saying that usually attributed to Adam Wildowski of Berkeley, the political scientist, that one story is an anecdote and 2 stories are data. So I've heard from 3, 4, 5 readers exactly this, so I figure, hey, it's a theme. So this book is in part a ghoulish book. There's a lot of dark in it, but there are streaks of light too. Svetlana Stalin was a very interesting woman, defected to the United States in 1967. She declared National Review her favorite publication, gave to us $500. She died not long ago, a few years ago, in a Wisconsin nursing home. Imagine, it was a rocky, turbulent, difficult life, in some ways a brave life. She was born in the 1920s in the Kremlin, the princess of the whole vast Soviet empire, and she died fairly out of the way in Richland Center, Wisconsin. And her youngest daughter, an American, manages a vintage clothing and jewelry boutique in Portland, Oregon. And by her photos, she is a Pacific Northwest hipster with dyed hair and tattoos and a nose ring, and she's Joseph Stalin's daughter. Imagine that. And her father was the late Wesley Peters, who was chief apprentice to Frank Lloyd Wright. So a strange life, a strange book, but not without interest. That's probably enough for me, John. You ready to go?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, let's start where you just left off, because I want to talk about Svetlana some more. She is one of the most fascinating characters in the book, and you devote a lot of time to her, I think for that reason. There was a part in the book that stood out to me at the end. You had mentioned your friend David Price Jones had Svetlana as a guest in his house at one point, and he said that she would refuse to talk about Stalin, but then she would come down from her room and talk exclusively about him and how she was haunted by this tension that she felt affection for him, but knew that he was a monster. And it was this internal struggle that, and it really is a struggle that very few of these children succeed in, to, as you say, quoting Solzhenitsyn, to live not by lies. Talk a little bit more about that struggle, because that to me is one of the most fascinating parts of the book, the struggle to accept what your father is, and not just internally, but externally.
They really won't. A few will, but most won't. It's a hard thing. You want to love your parents and be loyal to them. I think it's a natural thing. But what if your father is a mass murderer? What then? That complicates the picture. Also, you've grown up in a cult of personality. You've grown up among worshipers of your father. And you probably are one too. Svetlana says in one of her memoirs that she never heard her father's name mentioned, except for such words as great and wise attached to it. So it takes a certain independence of conscience to see through all that, to see through the propaganda and the cult of personality. And it takes some bravery to face the facts. There's a lot of denial going on among the sons and daughters of dictators. And I think it has to be that way. It has to be that way, otherwise they'd go nuts. And some are nuts enough as it is. And I include this in the afterword of my book, I think. When I was writing my book, I was walking in my neighborhood, and there was a sign, a poster for a Broadway show, Jersey Boys, which is about early rock and roll. And the tagline on the poster was, "Everyone remembers it the way he needs to." And I think this is true of a lot of the people I've studied. They have to remember it, or they have to misremember it. They have to misconstrue it and spin it. Otherwise, it's just too hard to take.
And very few of them remember it with moral clarity and are able to live as adults in full moral clarity about what their fathers were. And really, in the book, there's only two children of dictators that are able to pull this off. One is Stalin's daughter, Svetlana. The other is Castro's daughter, Alina.
Those two defected. One of Castro's daughters, two in fact, have come to Miami. Alina Fernandez wrote a book about her experiences. She escaped with a false passport and a wig. It was relatively easy for her. She had privileges on the island. But others have doubts, and of course we can't know what they're thinking unless they tell us. Mao's son, for example, had doubts about what he was seeing, and he was made to write a self-criticism. He was killed in the Korean War. He was a so-called volunteer for the Kim forces. And Ceausescu had a daughter who doubted for a while, and in fact refused to use her last name. She told her fellow students, "Call me mademoiselle." But later she was loyal. There was a Gaddafi son who tried to go straight, as I put it. Saif al-Islam, his name is. He tried to be a Western-style liberal or an Arab reformer. He talked a lot about democracy. He got a PhD from the London School of Economics and so on. Went to Davos, where I met him. But in the end, when the crunch came, the civil war began in Libya, he returned to his father, to the dictatorship, committed war crimes, and is now wanted by The Hague. And I think that the ties of, call it blood or family or native dictatorship, that was all too strong for him. He wanted to rise above it, but couldn't. I think that makes him a tragedy. A lot of these stories are tragic, but I think he is especially tragic because he really knew better. But in the end, he just couldn't pull away. Perhaps because he really wanted to succeed his father.
Right. And you see this struggle kind of playing out in all these in most of these children. There's not much of a struggle with, say, Uday Hussein, but one particular character in your book that you put kind of in a class by himself is Idi Amin's son, Jafar, who you either met or corresponded with for this book, who kind of charts a middle path between rejecting his father's legacy and recognizing that there was something wrong and trying to reconcile it.
Look, he is almost schizo, as we used to say in junior high. So Idi Amin had 60 children. Yes, 60. Oh, sorry, my back is to you, isn't it? Sorry about that. Hi. Jason's checking his phone. I understand, you're working, Jason, I understand. And he's heard all this before. Amin had 60 children. There were 21 mothers. These are official children. I think there were some extra ones. And the first one was born in 1948. And the last one was born in the mid-90s. That's a heck of a span. And he was sort of a jolly big daddy to this army of children. They called him Big Daddy. He could be very strict, but also very fun-loving. Spent most of exile in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah, where he took some of the family. Their favorite pastime was to go to the Safeway in their Chevy Caprice Classic. But there is one son, Jafar. Yeah, and here's another tidbit since I'm on Idi Amin. You know, his favorite food in all of life, which was available in Jeddah, was Kentucky Fried Chicken. And that's probably the only thing that the dictator of Uganda and I have in common. We both love Kentucky Fried Chicken. One of the sons is Jafar, and he has led reconciliation efforts in Uganda. He's an interesting character in that, as you say, on one hand, he's an apologist for his father, a whitewasher of that dictatorship. On the other, he has moments of clarity and conscience. He can almost see it for what it was. He is a straddler, and that does make him very unusual. Other children simply want to clam up. You know, Tojo had 7 children, and he was, in a sense, a conscientious father, and he prepared his children for his execution in a rather thoughtful way, I think. And the youngest child, Kimmy, a daughter, in the 1950s went to the University of Michigan and lived in the same residence hall as my mother, who had left the year before. She married an American, Kimmy Tojo did, became a US citizen. She now lives in Honolulu, a stone's throw from Pearl Harbor. And her father attacked Pearl His youngest child is now a U.S. citizen who sent me a note, a polite no thank you, whose return address stamp bore the image of the Jefferson Memorial. I thought, what a strange turn for history to take. But hers is a happier ending than most of these kids' endings are.
You ask at the end of the book, sort of rhetorically, how much slack should we cut these characters?
Yeah.
How much slack should we cut them? I mean, some
I
of
don't
them
really
are more
know.
sympathetic than others, but all of them, you know, have a huge kind of moral problem in their lives.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to say. I sometimes had a hard time knowing whether a particular person was a victim or a victimizer. Often he's both, but is he more victim or more victimizer? Sometimes these things blend. You don't want to let them off the hook entirely because they make choices, and some of the choices are better than other choices. That's true. They do have some, I don't know, let's call it agency. This gets a little fancy. But I remember while I was writing this book, I was talking to one of Solzhenitsyn's sons, a friend of mine, Ignat, who's a musician. We were talking about the Stalin children. And Stalin had a son, Vasily, who was a perfect little monster. He was a horrible man who committed terrible crimes. He had absolute license, except when his father stopped him. And he went through life wreaking destruction. Right. And it occurred to me that Vasily and Ignat are exact counterparts, because Vasily was a son of the worst man in the history of the Soviet Union. Ignat is a son of the best man in the history of the Soviet Union. Neither one chose this. And in Vasily's case, I mean, imagine this. First of all, he's born to Joseph Stalin. His mother kills herself when he's 11. Then he's really raised by Stalin's bodyguards. And these are the hardest, meanest, most brutal men in the whole NKVD, the Soviet secret police. You know, it would have been, I'm not excusing Vasily, heaven knows, terrible man. But that was a lousy hand. That was a lousy hand. And after some imprisonment, he drank himself to death when he was in his early 40s. And so did Ceausescu's son, Nicu.
And those two, with a couple of others, share something in common that not all these children share, that there was at least the possibility that they would be groomed for succession. In Niku's case, certainly in Hussein's case, but Svetlana...
Yeah, Uday was psychotic.
Right.
Really, truly psychotic.
Is there a difference in your mind
So bad
between...
that his father, who was psychotic enough, really couldn't anoint him the successor.
Right, and it was a mercy that he got shot up so badly that he couldn't succeed in a way, for Iraq anyway. But is there a difference between those children who are groomed to be successors and know it, and those children who know they're not being groomed to be successors?
Sure.
And then there's a handful of women who know they're not going to succeed, but end up helping their father sort of run the dictatorship. That's an interesting group of people.
You really read this book, John.
I did.
That's great. That's wonderful. It's true. Yes, there were 4 or 5 daughters who would have been the successor had they been of the other sex. But they couldn't be the successor because they were women. But they would have been. I think Assad's eldest daughter, definitely Duvalier's eldest daughter, perhaps a daughter of Kim Jong-il would have been the 3rd Kim dictator, but she couldn't be. That is quite right. Gaddafi had a daughter, we had 7 sons and 1 daughter. And the daughter was a lawyer who had studied in Paris. All these kids study in the West, by the way, in free and democratic countries. They all do. And she was a member of Saddam Hussein's defense team, legal defense team.
You also say that the adoration of dictators is strange, and I agree. It's a little bit less strange, the adoration of dictators by their children, because there is familial loyalty. But there's also, you touch on adoration of dictators among the people that they ruled within those countries. And I wonder, does it strike us, do you think it strikes us as Americans, or British perhaps, more strange than other people from other nations, because
Probably.
because we have such maybe a genetic national genetic aversion to the notion of a dictator. And so it makes it hard for us to...
I hope that's true. I hope that's true. I think people can accommodate themselves to anything. And one of the things I learned in adulthood, let's say, and it sort of bothered me, is that dictatorships always have popular support, always. So, by the way, do terror movements. It's hard to accept, but it's true. I always liked the idea that a dictatorship was a cadre of very bad people, ruling it over the masses at point of bayonet. And that's true to a degree. But all of these guys and all of these regimes have popular support. They don't submit themselves to elections, but frankly, some of them could. There's genuine admiration for these strongmen. Plus, in some cases, many cases, it's all people know. So it's normal to them. And they're made to feel secure by this father figure. And when Stalin died, there was genuine grief. Lots of people died that day, March 5th, 1953, because they were trampled in mourning mobs. It's a very hard thing for people like us to accept. Take the case of ISIS. I was talking with, I think his formal title is Canon White. He's the so-called Bishop of Baghdad, about 3 months ago. And I said, does ISIS have popular support in Iraq? Oh, yes, lots. It's very hard to take, but it's something to contend with. And I think one reason that so many of these children, my kids, so to speak, remain in denial, to use a popular term, is that they're surrounded by people who are the same, by a remnant from the regime, by a hardcore of supporters, by well-wishers, by fellow denialists, and also by younger people, people who didn't experience the regime, who imagine that that period was a better period, especially when times are tough now.
At the end of the book, you mentioned that Paul Johnson had planned to write a book about dictators, sort of a theme.
Monsters.
Monsters,
Bad
he was
people.
going to call it.
Yeah.
And he said he didn't want to, he decided not to do it because he didn't want to spend that much time in the company of such people. Reading through your book, and I did read it, and I read it, read it rather quickly.
Wow.
But there's a sense, as you read it, there's a sense, there's a sort of a mounting sense of revulsion that a reader experiences at the thought of all these dictators, this sort of succession, this parade of horribles that you kind of are marching through the 20th century. And as you're reading, you know, some of the chapters are mercifully short because you kind of just want it to be over at some point. Not that there's anything wrong with the writing, of course.
That's a hell of a blurb from my book. You just want it to be over. John Davis. Yeah. But I remember that for the paperback. Buy this book. You'll be glad when you're done.
But I mentioned it because of the moral kind of dimension to it. Yeah. And I wanted to know, is it, if it's difficult,
well, you're such a good man.
On some level to
other
read.
Readers have said, "Boy, this is juicy. I love it." But yeah, I mean, you're just obviously a moral, upright person, so you were repulsed.
Was it difficult to write it, though?
Yeah.
Parts of it.
Yeah, I'm joking. See, Paul Johnson said. He said in so many words, "I'm too old now to spend my time in such company. I want to do something more cheerful." But he did write A Short Life of Stalin afterward. And he confirmed to me that he had so much material left over from his preparation for the book he never wrote. He used it on this little Stalin bio. But I must say, I was glad to be done. I was glad to begin it. I was glad to write it, and I was glad to be done with it. I wrote a history of the Nobel Peace Prize before, which I loved writing, the issues and many of the characters, and that could have gone on and on for me. But I was ready to be through with this book. I was. There's a lot of dark in it, but as I say, streaks of light. And I think it's possible to have a better understanding of stuff as a result of this study.
There was a book a couple of years ago.
And sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
And dictatorship, it never ends. And so individual dictatorships do, but new ones always spring up. We seem to be entering a new age of the strongman, where the rule of law is eroding, and even people's desire for it. Really, this is a dirty little secret and a rotten thing to say, but people really don't want the rule of law. They want the result. They want the consequence, the result, the outcome that they want. Rule of law, oh, sure, they like the rule of law if they get their way in the end. And so a person who likes the rule of law for its own sake is a pretty rare person, I think. Anyway, go ahead, John, sorry.
Well, just building off that, Bashar Assad is an interesting one. He wasn't groomed for succession. He was an eye surgeon in London well into his 40s, I think, when he was called back and
he was
took
younger,
a crash course in dictatorship and took over the country. And now, with the civil war in Syria, he is well on his way to becoming as brutal a butcher of his own people as the top tier dictators.
Certainly in percentage terms, if I can be ghoulish about it. I mean, Pol Pot killed between a quarter and a third of the Cambodian population. That's pretty hard work. I mean, it really takes a lot of killing. This was a spasm of killing. Very brief period. Yeah, Bashar Assad never wanted anything to do with power, politics, dictatorship. He was a shy, awkward, ungainly person, kind of gawky to look at, skinny with a long neck. And his elder brother, Basil, was the anointed one. He was a designated successor. He was everything you would want in a dictator. He was smart, he was handsome, he was glamorous, he was athletic, he was brave, and people liked him a lot. And I think they really, in Syria, they look forward to his being dictator because the old man, Hafez, was so brutal. And then one morning, Basil was rushing in a sports car to catch a plane. He was late. It was a foggy morning in Damascus. And in front of the Damascus airport, there was a circle, a roundabout, and he flipped his car and died. And that very day, Assad summoned his second son, Bashar, home from London to be groomed. And Bashar has kept the family business going. He has done all the killing necessary. You could say almost in his defense, not in his defense, but in understanding, there's a sense of kill or be killed, and if he falls, the Alawite community from which he springs gets massacred in all likelihood. But here was a guy who stepped up to the plate, so to speak, and who has proven very, very loyal. He first entered his father's office when he was 7 years old. He burst in excitement because he just had his first French lesson. French was then the language of the Syrian elites. He was so excited about it, he wanted to tell his dad about it. He never entered that office again until after his father's funeral, when he himself was dictator. And he has done the murderous necessary.
And I can't remember if you mentioned it. Does he have children?
Yes. Hafez is his son, or one of his sons. I can't remember whether there's more than one. Named after his grandfather. And already Assad loyalists are thinking of him as the next one.
There was a book that came out a couple of years ago, a pamphlet that was called My Dear Son, written by Stalin's mother. It wasn't written by Stalin's mother.
Yeah.
It was a transcript of audio recordings taken in the mid-1930s before she died. And it's a curious little book because you get an account of Joseph Stalin from his mother's perspective. And of course, she loved her little Joseph and loved and speaks affectionately about him. And
Was disappointed he wasn't a priest.
Right, she was disappointed, almost like she's a typical mother. She sounds like a typical mother.
He had been a seminarian, yeah.
But she
So had Castro.
She goes on and on, talking about him and how what a good son he was to her, and but it's a glimpse into.
She never left Georgia, never went to Moscow where he ruled. Always remained. Couldn't speak Russian.
Right.
Yeah.
But it brings this sort of human side to one of the worst dictators, of modern times. And I wonder what other moments in your research, you say in this book, some of these people were very difficult to research and their children were difficult to find information. What other tidbits of humanity kind of popped out at you when you were researching these people?
They're few and far between. Mussolini loved his daughter Etta, his firstborn. One thing I discovered, this is a pattern. I don't know if it's true of men in general, but these guys, my guys, they love their daughters, especially the first one. There's a special bond. And Mussolini adored his daughter Etta, and she adored him back. She later married Count Ciano. And Mussolini, they were, after the wedding, which was the event of the decade in Rome, they went off in their sports car with Etta driving to their honeymoon on the Isle of Capri. And Mussolini, with his motorcade, followed them. He couldn't bear to let her go. And she had to stop, confront him, and make him turn around. Now, later, Count Ciano was executed. Mussolini did not stay the execution of his son-in-law. And say you're Etta, your two favorite people in the whole world are your father and your husband, and the one kills the other. As we say in my home state of Michigan, that's a kind of ticklish situation. And how do you... Also, Saddam Hussein's daughters, two of them, had the same experience. He killed their husbands. And this is something, I try to slip into the skin of these people to the extent possible, but sometimes it's pretty hard. I think most of these dictators, John, really don't know their children. They're there for ceremonial moments, big occasions. But often these fathers are very remote to the children, and that makes the children adore them all the more and treasure the contacts they have with their dad for the very fewness of them.
And I guess the most extreme example maybe is Mao, in terms of not even really acknowledging his children, having almost no contact with them, all but ignoring the fact that he had children, and had children by multiple wives, as most of these guys do. I don't know
Not
how...
necessarily wives.
Right, well, right.
Now, Mao, to me, he may be the most chilling of the dictators, because he was a man almost completely devoid of human feelings. He was almost an ideological robot. He wasn't happy, he wasn't sad, he wasn't mad, he wasn't glad. He was so cool, so detached. People to him were just so much experimental material, And it's hard to say exactly how he viewed his children, but a guy like Saddam Hussein, forgive me for saying so, but you can almost understand him. He was given to volcanic rages, for example. He was an extreme human being. He was a murderer and a monster. He was a human being on the fringe, if you will, at the extreme. But you can Mao didn't have volcanic rages. He never would have. He was far too self-controlled for that. And I think that makes him certainly, possibly the eeriest of all the dictators.
Now, Uday Hussein was given to volcanic rages like his father, and he may be the one example in the book of a child who out-monsters their father. What is the difference? You put him in a class a little bit with Stalin's son Vasily. Why, in your view, was Uday Hussein almost singularly monstrous out of this group of children?
He had, I don't know, but he had absolute license and took full advantage of it. There were 27 million people in his country, Iraq. There was no one to stop him from doing whatever he wanted except for one man, his dad. And sometimes Saddam stopped him, most of the time he didn't. And the same is true of Nicu Ceausescu, who swaggered and raped and murdered and terrorized his way through life until the Ceausescu dictatorship was brought down. But Nicu had an older brother, Valentin, who had the same license. I guess the same license. And as far as I know, he has lived blamelessly. He has never harmed a hair on anyone's head. He never wanted anything to do with power or dictatorship, politics. He became a physicist. He has worked at the same scientific institute on the outskirts of Bucharest for the whole of his career. Quiet guy with a circle of friends, pretty well liked. Where does that leave us with this nature-nurture question? I really don't know.
Sort of an indictment of nurture, I would think.
As our president said in a different context, that's above my pay grade. And I'm not sure. In my book, I do a little bit of generalizing, mainly in the foreword and the afterword, and a little bit of psychologizing, but not much. Because honestly, every time I went to make a general statement, I found that I could contradict it. So And in fact, a critic who's reviewed my book has knocked me for this, and maybe she's right, that I don't do enough generalizing and synthesizing. I could have, and I think I could have done it pretty eloquently, but it wouldn't have been all that honest. It would have been stretching. I could have done it. People said, "Oh yeah, those are the themes." Interviewers ask me, "What are your takeaways?" Well, I sometimes kind of make stuff up, but there are some themes. But honestly, maybe this is my bias as a conservative or a classical liberal. These are individual stories, and the difference between Valentin Ceausescu and Nicu Ceausescu is night and day. That's what I can tell you.
I want to make sure we have time for discussions. I don't know what the
Have I
time.
mortified the whole room?
No. This is a fascinating subject, and you say the two phrases in the book that people are interesting, people are strange. Those are your generalizations, which are very general generalizations. But there's such a diverse group of people that have such different fates, and who all have something very profound in common. It would be a rather high barrier to generalize about this group, because
I think so.
Because look at what became of all of them. Do we have a microphone, and we have some time for discussion and questions? If there are no discussion and questions, then we can just keep talking. But we'll go over here first, and then we'll go back there, and then we'll go in the middle.
Years ago, I read a book called Cradles of Eminence, and I think it was written in the 30s, and they took very eminent people and found what was common in their cradle amongst these, and they were listed 10 things. Did you find sort of a thread of commonality amongst the cradles of these monsters?
Yes. In my book, I don't go into the parents of the dictators, but I can tell you a little about Saddam Hussein. Let's see if I can remember. His father took off immediately. He never knew his father. Then there was a stepfather who abused him. Then he went into the home of an uncle, his foster father, who revered Hitler. How do you like that? He later became the mayor of Baghdad, that man. So that was quite a start. I don't know if there's a pattern, frankly. I don't know. But a lot of these guys feel themselves injured or disadvantaged early on and want to take it out on the world for the rest of their lives. This is certainly true of Fidel Castro, who I think deeply resented his illegitimate birth and deeply resented people around him who were more respectable and who really wanted to, this gets a little psychology-y, but I think he wanted to punish the Cuban people for the rest of his life, and he has. Yeah. And by the way, the people I think who know the most about Castro say that he was never a communist, never. He was always a fascist. That's where his sympathies lay. But when he rose to power, fascism was over, and communism was on the rise. And as was told to me by knowledgeable people, Raoul was always a communist. He liked Marxism, Leninism. He studied in the Soviet Union. Fidel, he was just a brute, just a caudillo, just a fascist who wanted to run the country and stomp his boot on the Cuban face.
We had one in the back here.
I don't know what construct you started out with, but I wonder if writing this book changed your conception about God in any way?
No, it didn't. I think that, and know that God is good, and all this stuff will, by and by, fade away, and not even be a memory. Just the old serpent, nothing.
How about free will?
Well, in my view, there's the, you didn't ask these questions, John. There's the human or the mortal and the divine. And here it seems that we have free will, or that we're ruled by others' wills. But in the end, either God is all or he isn't. One or the other. I don't think there's much middle ground there. And so there's a hymn that goes, "Oh, side with God and win." So that's what I have to say about it. I can either talk for 20 seconds on that subject or hours, so better choose the 20 seconds.
I think we had a question in the lady in the middle right there. Was third?
Who's just come back from Scotland.
Thank you. Thinking of my history of all these monsters, part of my thought is how many of them are children of monsters themselves? And I'm trying to visualize when these folks were kids, and how many of them were the schoolyard bullies, and how many of them were the ones who nobody ever talked to. And you can follow that through to the kids. I don't know if they were, as kids, practicing bullies, or the ones who didn't turn out well, or do we know enough about them as children to see what if there were patterns?
These people are filled with resentment or grandiosity or both. And I'll tell you a couple of dirty little secrets about dictators. It's not so secret, but they're really smart. They're high IQ, brainy people. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. You're not going to find any dummies among dictators at all. And also they tend to be very personable, even charismatic, charming, with a kind of magnetic effect. That's a bad thing to say, we don't want to hear it, but it's true.
Although
It's
Mao,
part of their pocket. Pardon?
Chairman Mao was not charismatic. He was one of the rare ones.
He wasn't personal, but he had a kind of hold over people. He was almost cruelly smart.
Right.
He was. And he commanded others, and they followed him naturally. I was talking to a foreign minister I know, ex-foreign minister now, about the last dictator in Europe, the only dictator in Europe now, Lukashenko of Belarus. And I said to him, kind of on the QT, who dealt with him, met with him, is he personable? Oh, very, very. They all are, these guys. It's part of how they rise. But don't underestimate, I shouldn't underestimate the cunning. For example, you hear about Stalin. Oh, he was on top because he was the most ruthless. Nonsense. All those Bolsheviks were ruthless, equally so. He was really smart. And that is something to watch. That is something to guard against. And thank heaven for the rule of law, because this type of person can spring up and take advantage of things, especially when a country is down. And then they see this false Messiah. They fall for it and often stay seduced for a very long time.
More questions there in the back?
Following up on the earlier question, to what degree do those people that migrated to the West sense a role of faith or religion in their conversion coming from a secular background?
Oh, those, I see. I thought you were going to say, all these kids study in the West. What good does it do? I don't know.
No, but
They go, yeah, oh, I see what you mean.
Religion or
I see what you mean.
faith in
Well,
their-
Svetlana had a conversion. She had a conversion. She was always a seeker. She went from religion to religion, from place to place. She was a vagabond the whole second half of her life after her defection. She even went back to the Soviet Union in a period of great disgruntlement in 1984. Immediately regretted it. Luckily for her, Gorbachev came to power and let her out after 18 months. She'd have been stuck there for the rest of her life and miserable. But trying to think of the question of religion. Mainly the deity in these countries is the dictator and the father. And the children follow suit. If they find God, they're a bit dangerous, because there's a power far above the all-powerful small f father, right? Now, Khomeini was the religious leader of his country, as well as the dictator. One of his grandchildren, not children, but grandchildren, became an out-and-out rebel, a liberal Democrat, a believer in liberal democracy. And he called for the overthrow of the regime that his father established. After we toppled Saddam, this kid, Hussein Khomeini, moved to Iraq, called for the liberation of his own country, Iran, came to the United States, visited the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. In the very early days of 2004, his grandmother, the imam's widow, called him back home urgently because the regime had issued physical threats against the family. If he kept talking and doing what he was doing, there'd be physical consequences to the family. So he hightailed it back home and has been under house arrest ever since.
You said earlier that, pivoting away from the book for just a second, I want you to expand on something you said earlier. You said people don't really like the rule of law. Mm-hmm. They like the result of the rule of law.
I've come to believe that with a heavy heart.
And I wonder if you would opine for a minute on how that statement or that idea fits in with some of what we're seeing in our country right now, with a kind of aversion to the rule of law, mostly on the left, but a little bit on the right. And to what degree maybe we're susceptible to the same thing that people who live under dictatorships are.
Well, a fellow journalist of mine said to me, he's kind of a centrist, sort of right of center. I asked him about President Obama's executive amnesty ruling, if you will. And he said, he said something like pro-amnesty, anti-edict. He thought what Obama had done was illegitimate, although he favored the result. Now, I think a man like that, a person like that, is relatively rare, really. You like the result, you kind of shrug, because you've gotten your way, and you think justice has prevailed. This is a point that Dinesh D'Souza makes, and when I first heard him make it, it struck me as sort of disturbingly true. People on our side talk a lot about freedom, independence, liberty, self-determination, and so on. Very few really care about those things. They want justice. That's why the word fairness works so well for the left. Is it fair? Is it just, don't mean this freedom jazz. Is it fair? Is it just? And it's important. What do little kids first say, those of you who are parents? That's not fair. They feel very strong in the sense of fair. That's not fair. He has this, and that's not fair, and I don't have this. That seems to me to be very, very human. And it works against the American ideal, really, which is the Constitution, a constitutional republic. I heard Judge Mukasey talking about this at a dinner the other night, the former Attorney General and then former judge, federal judge, and said, you know, cases ought to be based on facts. And said we have today narratives, stories. What's fair, what's unfair. It's very, very human. And I think I've discovered more and more in adulthood how rare the rule of law really is. These tend to be parentheses in history. This really is an exceptional nation, an exceptional system.
I think we had a question here in the middle, the center, and then we'll go back over here.
I was interested in the specific case of Saif al-Islam. Did you get the sense that his return to Libya may have been with the goal of being a reformer if he had managed to secede?
He would no doubt say that.
But would that have been an honest statement?
I think so. I think so. He probably thought he couldn't achieve what he wanted to achieve in Libya if his father's dictatorship fell. But it also could be showing the rest of his family, I'm with you, I'm one of you. I am Gaddafi's son. My father's threatened, his regime is threatened with overthrow. I'm here. I think he could do no other, really. I think a sense of, dare I call it, Arab honor, even more than human honor, kicked in. And you don't abandon your family, your clan, and all that it's doing. Otherwise, he would have been a kind of traitor. I think he had to. I think he felt compelled to.
Wasn't he then, though, he became, though, a traitor to the ideals that he professed as an adult.
Yes. Yeah. But he'd also tell you, how do you like the authorities in Libya now?
Right.
Any better than Dad? Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, in Tunisia, though, they just got a Nobel Peace Prize, didn't they?
Yes. Yes.
As a person who's written a book about the Nobel Peace Prize, what are your thoughts on the Tunisian Quartet?
I think it was an honorable selection. Yes. And I'm very glad that it wasn't an Obama administration official and a member of the Iranian dictatorship. Very glad.
Which it could have been.
Oh, certainly.
Maybe a back-to-back for Obama. It could have been a second Peace Prize.
There's no limit to how many times you can win the thing. No.
No matter how much good he does in Syria, they're not going to give it to him again.
You know, they're churlish that way.
I thought we had a question over here. No? Yes, sir.
Can't wait to read your book, but you've intrigued me with this excellent point about the rule of law and your concern that you see a lot of eerie feeling that that's not really the most important thing, not only on the left, but on the right.
And by the way, let me just interrupt you. Yeah, I shouldn't exempt myself.
Exactly.
I shouldn't exempt myself. I just want my problem solved. You know, I'm on the phone talking to her. I just solve my problem. Get it, bottom line it for me. So, yeah.
But doing your research on this book, you've obviously gotten into the mindset of the fathers, the dictators.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a leading question, but has it occurred to you that our current president might be the least fond of the rule of law since FDR or Woodrow Wilson?
Yes. 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 I can see him assuming, and I think this is true of many, many people, assuming dictatorial powers on grounds that it's for the good of the people and the good of man. And that's probably a very human thing too. None of these dictators wakes up in the morning thinking, you know, today I'm going to be an evil dictator. I'm going to imprison, torture, and kill a lot of people. They all fancy themselves benefactors of mankind. And they consider their enemies of mankind. Sometimes it's an ideological veneer, as in communism. Sometimes it's just a personal cult, as you often find in the Arab world and in Africa. But all these dictators imagine themselves doing good. And they have a lot of people around him. They have a lot of people around them who reinforce that very fiction. But Obama, you know, this is related to it. Like Reagan, I was never for the 22nd Amendment, which limits a president to 2 terms. This was the Republican Party's revenge on Roosevelt. It sort of tripped us up, you know, probably could have run Eisenhower a 3rd time. And Reagan always said that after he retired from office, he was going to get back on what he called the mashed potato circuit and campaign for the repeal of the 22nd Amendment. I must tell you, I've grown very fond of the 22nd Amendment. and because, I mean, you think Clinton wouldn't have won a 3rd term in 2000? I mean, his vice president, one of the most, in my view, one of the least likable men in America, got more votes that year in 2000. So, as I say, in my head, I probably think the 22nd Amendment is not quite right, but I'm really glad to have it. I'm really glad to have it.
We're out of time, but I wanted to mention a couple more events we're going to have here on October 19th, a primer on transparency and accountability in state agencies. On November 3rd, we'll have a book discussion and signing with H.W. Brands on his new book, his new biography of Reagan. And then November 19th and 20th, we have a Crossroads Energy and Climate Policy Summit here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're going to have a table with books, and Jay is going to sign some books out in the lobby. And I just want to thank him for being here and ask you to join me in thanking him for coming to talk to us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.